Hello there, welcome to another SOCKETWorx training video. This one's all about connecting to SQL databases. The session content is broken down into three basic sections. We're first going to look at the security side of SQL Server Management Studio. I want to focus on creating a login that's specific for SOCKETWorx. And then once we have that login, we're going to use that login as a role or a user to refine the connectivity of that user to databases. Then we're going to go ahead and create a database. I want to focus on adding tables and emphasize how important the primary keys are. So we'll be adding a table with and without primary keys and see what the end results are going to be. Finally, we're going to go into SOCKETWorx and connect to this new database, refresh the database, and then I'll walk in as a user to try and view the data within the database.
Well, here we are in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, commonly referred to as SSMS. The first thing that we're going to do is prepare for SOCKETWorx and the SOCKETWorx connection. SOCKETWorx needs to connect to your database to read and write data. So providing those credentials or permissions is one thing that should be accomplished when setting up a SOCKETWorx deployment. We're going to start out by looking at the security side of SSMS. Under security, if I expand that, we're going to see logins, roles, credentials, audits, server audit specifications. We're just going to focus on the logins. There's a bunch of logins here that get established when you install, SA being one of them for the server administrator. You don't want to provide server administration rights to SOCKETWorx, so we are going to create a new login. So to accomplish that, we click on Logins, right-click, and then click on New Login. With this established, we can go ahead and provide a login name. I'm going to go ahead and use SOCKETWorx. Now, Windows authentication is one way, but because we don't have any Windows users logging in, we're just going to go ahead and use SQL Server authentication. This does require a password, so I'll enter a password and confirm the password. Now, this is also nice because these credentials should be ever persistent. We don't have users or the risk of this user changing their password. So I'm going to uncheck enforce password policy. And that's really all there is to it. We do have server roles here.
There are numerous server roles, but there's one checked public. We're just going to use this one for now. Perhaps we'll circle back around and change this later, but public should work just fine.
And then we have user mapping. We do not have any databases within our application right now, but one of the things that a database administrator should do is to go ahead and provide access to that database. We'll come back to this. Okay, now that we have our SOCKETWorx login, let's go ahead and create a new database to log into. So currently there are no databases in this instance. So to create a new database, we're just going to right click and create new database. I'm going to give it a database name. How about my first project? And really that's all we have to do at this point in time is provide a name, and we'll go ahead and click OK for that. So when you create a new database, you also have a security section underneath that database. And underneath the database, you can add users. Right now, we don't have any users, or we don't have our SOCKETWorx user. So one of the things we could do is add that user here, but we can also add it at a global level now that the database exists. So I'm going to go back to the global level here under security, right click, go to properties. And now if I look under mapping, I'm going to see my first project. And once I select my first project, then I can provide role memberships. And here we're going to provide data reader and data writer. These are the only permissions that SOCKETWorx needs, so you further protect your data structure. Okay, we'll click OK. Now that we've done this at the global level, we can go back to our users here and we can see that SOCKETWorx indeed was added to my first project. All right, so we've got the security side done. Let's move on to putting some tables in our database. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a new table. Again, right click and new. And I'm going to provide a new table ID. I'm going to make this an integer value, and I'm not going to allow nulls. I'm also going to make this or set this as a primary key. So by right clicking on the chevron, I can set as a primary key, and you'll notice you'll get a little gold key. This is a requirement for SOCKETWorx to have a primary key if you want to make modifications to this particular table. If I don't have a primary key, then I will not be able to make modifications, and it will be rendered as a view-only table within SOCKETWorx. So let me go ahead and just add a few more fields. Data 1, we'll make this a var char. Let's say 50. We'll add data 2, copy the one from above just to keep it consistent. So there we go. We have a new table created. Now the one thing that we also want to do is have this unique identifier, the primary key, auto increment. So to do that, if I expand the window down here for this field, I can expand the isIdentity property, and currently it's set to no. If I double click on this, it sets it to 1, and it will start at 1 and increment by 1. I can't think of any other reason to change those values as long as it's just going to auto increment for me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this table. I can do that by clicking the Save button or just simply close the table. And upon exit, if it hasn't been saved, which I know it hasn't because there's a little asterisk at the end of the name, it will ask me to save a table and provide a table name. And we're going to call this table with primary key. All right, so if I highlight tables and I refresh, there's my first table with primary key. And if we expand that table, we're going to see the 3 fields that were added, and indeed one has the primary key, which is identified with a little key. Let's go add another table, and this one we're going to add without a primary key. So I'm going to call this new table ID once again, make this an integer, not allow nulls. I'm going to go ahead and make this a identity column so it will automatically increment. The only thing I'm not going to do is set a primary key. We'll go ahead and put in data 1. We'll enter the field as a varchar again just to be consistent. And then we'll add one more piece of data. All right, there you have it. Though it's the second table, to get that saved, we'll go ahead and call this table without primary key. All right. If we refresh the tables, the table view, we've got a table without a primary key. Sure enough, there's no primary key. And we have another table with a same fields, but with the primary key. So that's the SQL Server side of things. We have a new database. We have a database with some tables. We have a SOCKETWorx login. So now we're ready to go connect to this database using SOCKETWorx. Okay, here we are in SOCKETWorx. I'm going to go ahead and log into SOCKETWorx. Once logged into SOCKETWorx, this is a brand new instance, so I don't have any connections. The only thing I'm going to get on the landing page here is the manuals. And the manuals will display only if you're logged into ecedesign.com. It is a subscription site and the manual is part of the subscription. Okay, I do not have any connections, so as a SOCKETWorx administrator, I need to go connect to a database to get things going. I'm going to go to my name, Joe Manual. I'm going to browse to the setup, and under setup, it's going to land on the settings overview. Here we can see we have an active user. Active connections is none. So the next step is to come down to connections and add a new connection. So on the connections screen, it's very simple to add a SQL database. In the header controls, we'll find Add New SQL Connection.
And up comes the Add Connection dialog box. The first thing we need to do is make the connection active. Then we have to give it a connection name. This is the user-friendly name that all the users will see. So you're going to want to enter in something like My First Project.
This is what the users will see in the interface. So it says connection name. That's also the user-friendly name that's going to be displayed, and that's what users are going to click on to get into the SQL database through SOCKETWorx.
The next field is the server name. This server name is the SQL Server instance that you're going to connect to. Best that we browse back to SQL Server Management Studio and see where to get this information from.
If I click on the SQL instance, the connection at the top, and then I right-click, I can go to Properties. Under the Properties, under the connection details, we'll see some information, but if I click on the hyperlink, it'll bring up another dialog box and I can easily access that connection information. What we're going to want is the server name here, just like we're being asked within the SOCKETWorx dialog. So I'm going to highlight that and do a copy. And then back to SOCKETWorx. And we can right-click and paste that value in there. Now the database is the new database that I added. And that database name was My First Project. The schema, now by default the schema was DBO. You could have different schemas, so it's important to know what the schema is of the database. Actually, let me go point that out to you before we get too much further. So back to SQL Server Management Studio, and if I look at my database, I'll see that my table names start out with dbo.tablename. That's the schema. Now there can be different schemas if your database administrator has set them up, but by default, most databases and their tables use the default DBO schema. Okay, we're down to the username and password. This is where we're going to enter that new login we created in SQL Server Management Studio. And that was SOCKETWorx and then the password. And that's it. That's all there is to connecting to a SQL server. So let's see what happens when we press save. And look at that, connection saved successfully. All right, we see an active project, my first project, our connection type was SQL, the server name, the database, and the schema. But there's one more step here that's very important. After you've connected to a database, you have to click the refresh. So for each of these connection records, we have record controls. The most important one when connecting to your databases is to refresh the connection. If we scroll over to the right, we'll notice here we have a few refreshed columns that are void of information. If they're empty, it means that we have not initiated a refresh. So let's go ahead and refresh. This does take a few seconds depending upon the size of your database. And there we got the notification that we're all done and that refresh was done successfully. And my name is in there as Joe Manuel and the date that I refreshed it. Okay, so if I want to see this information, we have to go ahead and add this connection to a role. So not only do we have security on the SQL Server side of things, but we also have security on the SOCKETWorx side as well. I am an administrator, so if I go to roles and I find the administrator role, the record controls allow you to add connections to each of the roles. So after a new database added, you have to add it to one of the roles. And here we can see the available list of connections and the selected list of connections. I can double click on this, or I could have used the arrows to move them back and forth. So once it's moved over, you click the save. And now, as an administrator, I have access to that connection. Let's go see what it looks like. So now if I click back to the dashboard, this takes me in as a user rather than an administrator. And if I expand the connections, there's my first project. And if I click on my first project, I'm going to get a couple errors. I'm going to get a couple errors because there is no data in those databases. No worries, SOCKETWorx can add data, at least it can add data if there's a primary key. So I'm going to go to my tables and look at my tables. I have a table with a primary key and I have a table without a primary key. But look how the table without the primary key has been classified. It's been classified as a view-only table, and that's because there is no primary key. And because there's no primary key, I cannot add any data to that table. So I'm going to go to the table with primary key and click on that. And I expect to get another warning because as an administrator, I did not set up any table views. So once this gives me the warning and brings me into the view page, I'm going to go ahead and have to create a new view. And it's telling me to create a new view in the view dropdown. To do that, we drop down the view manager. We go ahead and add a new view, give it a view name. My first view sounds good. And now I can take and move one or all pieces of information into my view. I'm going to make this a global read so that anybody else that walks into SOCKETWorx will be able to see this view as well. We'll save the other bits for later. So we save, and then we close. Okay, so now I have a view into my table. There are my 3 fields, but there are no records in that database. So how do we change that? SOCKETWorx has some microservices to add rows to a database. So if I click on the add rows, I can come in and go ahead and add 10 fields. Now I've got 10 fields and look at my auto number. So my auto number did exactly what it should have done as defined by the database. And that's how you get started with SOCKETWorx. Well, this is the end of this video content. We covered a lot of ground, but we've now shown how we can set up a SQL database. We can add a new user
with credentials at the database level. We can use those credentials when connecting to that database with SOCKETWorx. And then we also saw how having tables with and without primary keys impacted our ability to add data and modify data once we got connected.